The evening promised to be grand. The grand hall, drowning in the golden glow of chandeliers, was decorated with exquisite taste. At the entrance there was a red carpet, on which flashes of cameras flashed. Guests dressed in designer outfits moved with confidence, exuding a sense of exclusivity. Jazz music softly complemented the buzz of lively conversations. It was a place where luxury was not just displayed, it was a statement. Yet, amidst the bright glitter and friendly smiles lurked a shadow of prejudice. Glances that lingered on unfamiliar faces longer than necessary. The quiet whispers that accompanied every step of those who didn't fit into the crowd's idea of their own. It was the kind of place where wealth and status were the ticket to entry. But if you didn't meet the unspoken standards, you became the object of discussion. When Big Shaq, the famous musician and artist, crossed the hall, silence seemed to envelope the space around him. His presence seemed to cause an invisible but perceptible crack in the perfectly thought-out picture of the evening. Tall, confident, he moved with dignity. He wore a stylish black suit, slightly informal, but it emphasized his charisma rather than violating standards. Still, something about the way he looked, perhaps his swarthy skin or his loud name, evoked a strange mixture of curiosity and restrained judgment. The staff at the entrance looked at each other, not hiding their doubts. The white-skinned woman in charge of checking invitations scrutinized his document as if she hoped to find an error in it. Her gaze lingered on his face, too long to be just a professional check. Her eyes read doubt and a hint of disrespect. The other guests, as they passed by, threw short, slithering glances, as if tacitly agreeing, "He doesn't belong here." His very presence seemed to violate the unspoken rules of this elitist space. But Shaq didn't seem to notice. His smile remained as casual as ever, his manners as impeccably polite. He realized that his every move here would be under close scrutiny. There was tension in the air, as if an invisible storm was gathering force. No one knew that on this night their glamorous performance would be shattered by the truth spoken loud and clear. The large double doors of the VIP area, covered in red velvet, seemed to separate worlds. Behind them you could hear the muffled sounds of glasses, the laughter of the elite, the echoes of discussions of deals and victories. This entrance was a status symbol, not just a door, but a pass to a world of privilege. For Big Shaq, however, it was a place of humiliation. As soon as he came closer, the white-skinned, cold-eyed employee extended her hand sharply, stopping him. Her face was a mixture of squeamishness and suspicion. Her manners contrasted sharply with the sophistication of the surroundings. "Your invitation," she said with icy politeness, extending her hand. Her eyes slid down to Shaq's from top to bottom, a look of mute reproach. "What are you doing here?" she said. Shaq calmly handed her an official pass. She studied it for too long, as if trying to find something suspicious in it that would allow her to refuse. Her face frowned more and more, and finally she spoke. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be a mistake. This area is for select guests. Are you sure this is the right place for you?" She sounded sarcastic behind a strained politeness. Shaq, keeping his composure, replied, "My name is on the invitation. Shall I check it again? Or do you want to check with the organizers?" Her smile turned into a contemptuous grimace. She didn't bother to hide her irritation. Perhaps someone on the staff made an oversight, handing out invitations to, well, let's just say random people. She paused, emphasizing the word random as if it were a sarcastic joke. Shaq noticed several guests standing nearby, furtively listening to the conversation. One of them even held back a chuckle. The woman, meanwhile, stepped closer, as if trying to take the dominant position, and added, "With these invitations, it's usually those who, work here. Maybe you're the maintenance staff? The kitchen's over there." The words cut like a blade. Shaq froze for a moment. The surroundings grew quieter. The other guests were starting to turn around. There was no doubt in her tone, only open humiliation. She didn't even try to hide her contempt for the man she thought had lost his way. Shaq took a deep breath, suppressing the rage that flared up inside, but he could feel the tension building. Every glance, every quiet whisper confirmed it. This was more than just defiance. It was an attempt to show him his place. But she didn't know yet that he wouldn't stand aside and accept her injustice. "Do you often judge people by their skin color, or did I become your first?" he said calmly but firmly, looking her straight in the eye. His words sounded like lightning in a clear sky. The employee flinched slightly, but her arrogance had not yet wavered. "I'm sorry, but I have to make sure you're really invited," she said, barely concealing the tremor in her voice. But Shaq could see that her confidence was fraying. The crowd behind him was beginning to see the injustice, and tensions were rising. This was only the first blow. The storm had not yet begun. The breeze from the open doors of the VIP area brought a light scent of expensive perfume and champagne. But the air in front of the entrance was saturated with a different odor: resentment and cold injustice. The white-skinned female employee, having recovered from Big Shaq's direct question, struggled to regain control. She glanced at him with a grin that read professional courtesy mixed with poorly concealed contempt. "It's not about you," she said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "It's just that we have a strict dress code here. Your costume is, too casual for this event." Shaq raised an eyebrow slightly. His face remained calm, but inside he could feel her words tugging at his heartstrings. He cast a glance around himself. The suit he had chosen had been specially tailored by a top designer. There was no informality here, only her bias. "Are you sure this is a dress code issue?" he asked in an even voice, but with a hint of defiance. She pretended not to hear his question and continued. "We make sure our guests are up to the level of the event. Everything has to be perfect. You know, our clients are used to certain standards." Her voice became quieter, and then a whisper was added. "And it's important to us that the atmosphere remains elite." Shaq noticed her gaze sliding over his skin again. The moment was so fleeting that someone else might not have noticed, but Shaq knew her words were a mask. She wasn't talking about the suit. She was talking about him, about how she thought it was inappropriate. His heart was beating faster, but he kept his composure. "Interesting," he said, looking straight into her eyes. "You talk about standards. Tell me, what's the standard that determines who can get in and who can't? The color of the tie or something else?" He paused, his voice deepening. "Maybe skin color?" Her face tensed, as if Shaq had said something she was afraid to hear. She lifted her chin, as if defending herself. "It's not like that at all," she answered quickly, but her voice sounded less confident. "We're just making sure everything's up to par. That's what we do." At that moment, another employee, a man dressed in the same uniform, approached them. He glanced anxiously at his colleague and then at Shaq. It was obvious that he had heard part of the conversation. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his tone more subdued, but his eyes were wary. "We have a situation here," the woman began, stepping ahead of Shaq. This gentleman," she emphasized the word with emphasis, "has presented an invitation, but it raises some questions. And his suit?" The man looked at Shaq, his gaze more professional but no less evaluative. Shaq noticed how his eyes lingered on the man's face and then quickly averted their gaze, as if he were trying to avoid a confrontation. "We have strict rules," the man said quietly. "We have to make sure that everything matches." He hesitated before he finished. "The image of the place." Shaq looked them both over, lingering his gaze on each a little longer than necessary to create tension. Then he said softly but confidently, "You know, it's interesting to watch rules appear out of thin air when it suits someone else. You see me and decide I don't fit in. But let's not pretend it's about dress code or image. It's about me. It's about how I look, isn't it?" His voice sounded like the thunderclap before the storm. They were silent, but their faces spoke for them. The crowd that had already gathered nearby was watching with increasing interest. Some whispered, others stared openly, waiting for events to unfold. Shaq knew they would not stop. Their arrogance was their weapon, but he felt that weapon was about to misfire. He waited for the moment to make his next move. There was a feeling in the air that this night would not end quietly. The crowd around the entrance to the VIP zone was growing like a storm cloud, thickening with every second. The guests, dressed in silks and diamonds, became quiet, as if they had caught the smell of impending drama. Some exchanged glances, some whispered quietly, and the bolder ones watched the scene as if waiting for the climax. The employee standing in front of Big Shaq must have felt the power of this invisible support. Her posture straightened, her voice became louder, her tone, which a moment ago had hidden its contempt behind a mask of professional coldness, now became harsh, almost hostile. "Sir, I've already explained," she began loudly so that everyone could hear her. "This area is for special guests only, for people of a certain level. I'm sorry, but people like you can't be invited here." Those words hung in the air like a dagger thrown in front of everyone. The crowd around him froze, then whispered louder. Some of the guests covered their mouths with their hands, others let out a quiet laugh, but many simply remained silent, not knowing how to react. It wasn't just a scene, it was a performance, with Shaq at the center of it. Shaq felt a wave of rage and humiliation run up his spine. Her words cut him like a knife, but he held on. His eyes were fixed on the employee's face, who was now looking at him with cold satisfaction, as if her words were the final blow to put him in his place. "People like me?" he repeated quietly, his voice low, but each note sounded like thunder in the tense silence. "Can you explain what that means? To everyone here who's obviously listening?" She flinched slightly, but didn't back away. Instead, she spoke even louder. "I'm sorry, but I'm only doing my job. And let's be honest, sir, you don't look like the kind of person who normally attends these events." Shaq heard someone in the crowd chuckle softly. Another guest turned away, pretending not to be interested. But this wasn't just a humiliation. It was an open statement, made in front of everyone who could see. Not only had she dared to question his status, but she had attempted to destroy his dignity. He looked at the crowd, sliding his gaze over the faces. Some averted their eyes, others watched with curiosity. There were some who were clearly enjoying the spectacle. These were the faces he knew. They saw him not as a celebrity, but as an object of judgment to whom the elitist world must remain closed. "It's interesting," he said at last, his voice calm but filled with an inner fire. "You say, people like me. You think you can determine who is worthy and who is not, who meets your standards and who doesn't. He stepped closer, his voice louder now, addressed to all who were watching. But let me ask you a question. Do you judge me by my suit, my face, or the color of my skin? Shaq's words cut through the silence like a blade. The crowd froze. The employee took a step back, her confidence beginning to crack. She tried to say something, but her voice was drowned in a new wave of whispers. I'm here because I was invited, because I deserve this place as much as any of you. But if you think you can judge me just because of the way I look, then maybe the problem isn't me, but your standards, Shaq continued, his words sounding like thunder. The crowd began to separate. Some guests who had been watching from the sidelines now averted their eyes, feeling embarrassed. But others, including one of the event organizers, moved forward, realizing that a mistake had been made that needed to be corrected immediately. The employee stood silent, her face pale. Her humiliating statement was now turning against her. She could feel the stares, but she didn't know what to say. Her power over the situation was gone, replaced by a rising tide of condemnation. Shaq knew this was only the beginning. He was no longer alone. He had the truth behind him now, and that truth was louder than all their quiet taunts. In the silence that enveloped the crowd, the only sounds were the echoes of someone's awkward laughter, which quickly died out, and the quiet rustling of glasses as the waiter tried to pass by unnoticed. But all eyes, without exception, were fixed on Big Shaq. His tall figure towered over many of those present, and his eyes, full of determination and power, seemed to pierce everyone who dared to look. Shaq took a step forward, shortening the distance between himself and the female employee, whose face was now pale but whose lips were still pressed into a thin line of arrogance. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked at the crowd, as if deciding to whom to address his words. It's not just an incident, he began, his voice flat, but each phrase sounded like a thunderclap. It is a mirror of how we, as a society, continue to judge, demean, and exclude people based on their skin color, their background, their appearance. Tell me, are these your standards? If so, they are not standards. They are chains. The crowd froze. No one dared interrupt him. Shaq felt that his words penetrated deeper than they had expected. Today, you have decided that I am not someone who deserves to be here. Tomorrow, it will be someone else. It never ends. And you know what the worst part is? It's not the people who do it. It's the people who stand by and let it happen. He circled the crowd with his gaze. His eyes stopped on a few of the guests who had just laughed at him. They averted their eyes. No one wanted to be the one to fall under that gaze. But before he could continue, a voice came from the crowd. A woman in an expensive dress with a pearl necklace stepped forward. Her face was a mixture of embarrassment and determination. Perhaps this is not the place for such a discussion, she said, trying to soften the situation, but her voice shook. We're here to celebrate, not... She faltered, searching for the words, social topics. Shaq turned to her, his gaze even sharper. And you don't think this is the place? This is the right place, because injustice loves the comfort of silence. It feeds on the silence of those who could have stopped it, but chose not to. Shaq's words seemed to tear away the last layer of comfort in the crowd. The whispers that had been barely audible a moment ago had turned into rumblings of outrage, confusion, and awkwardness. Some of the guests had already started to move away. Others, on the contrary, moved closer to see how this would end. And just at that moment, when the tension was at its peak, A man emerged from the far end of the hall. He was dressed in a strict suit, and his gait was confident. It was the host of the event, an influential businessman whose name was known to all present. His face was stern, but his gaze was directed directly at the employee who was still standing in the center of attention. "What's going on here?" His voice cut through the silence. The employee turned around, her confidence crumbling completely. "It's a misunderstanding, sir," she began, but Shaq interrupted her. "It's not a misunderstanding," he said, looking directly at his host. "This is open discrimination. I'm not standing here to be part of your party, but to remind you. These places are not about exclusivity, but about humanity." The owner of the hall seemed to understand. He looked at Shaq, then at the crowd, and finally at the employee. Her face was pale, already realizing that things hadn't gone according to her plan. "You're fired," he said without even looking at her. His voice was as cold as ice. The crowd froze in shock. It was unexpected. No one had expected the situation to turn so quickly. Shaq, although he felt satisfied with justice, was not smiling. It was clear to him. Firing the female employee would not solve the problem. It was only the tip of the iceberg. "Do you think this will solve everything?" he asked, looking directly at the master of the hall. "It's not the end. It's just the beginning. Because she didn't create this culture. You did. We all did." And again, his words sounded like thunder. No one whispered now. No one laughed. The crowd stood in complete silence, realizing that they were witnessing something more than just a party scandal. This was the moment of truth. The silence in the hall seemed deafening. Only the faint clinking of glasses and the rustling of clothes broke this tense silence. The host stood motionless, his stern gaze fixed on Big Shaq, who, in turn, did not avert his eyes. The crowd around him began to move like waves, sensing that the climax of this scene had not yet arrived. The employee who had just been fired took a step back, her face white with shock. Her lips trembled, but before she could say anything, Shaq interrupted her with his firm voice. "It's too easy," he said, turning to the host of the evening. "Firing her is a convenient way out. But let's be honest, she's just a pawn here, and those who hired her are behind her actions. Those who have created a system where people like her think they have the right to judge people based on their skin color or background." His words hung in the air like thunder, and for a moment everyone stopped moving. The master of the event frowned, his gaze intense. "The charges are serious," he finally said, trying to keep his cool, "and I will not tolerate discrimination at my events. But you saw for yourself, I just punished the guilty party." Shaq frowned, his voice even louder. "It's not just about her. It's about you. You think you can just erase your responsibility by punishing one person? But where was your responsibility when you created this atmosphere? When you hired the people whose job it is to close the doors to those who don't fit in?" The crowd began to move closer, as if drawn by his words. The guests, who had only been watching, were now witnessing a revelation that was much broader than they had expected. Suddenly, a voice came from deep within the crowd. "He's right," said a man, stepping forward. It was one of the waiters, dressed in a simple uniform. His face was tense, but he looked determined. "This isn't the first time. We've all seen it. He pointed to the staff at the entrance. "They're specifically instructed to detain people who don't fit. And it's not just about clothes." The guests gasped. The crowd began to murmur, some looking at the host accusingly, others with frank interest. The host turned pale, but his voice still sounded confident. "This is ridiculous," he said, trying to maintain control. "We have no such instructions. This is absurd." But the waiter didn't stop. He looked at Shaq and continued. "We know all this. We're instructed to pretend to follow the dress code, but really, it's just an excuse. It's always an excuse. They look at people and decide who is spoiling the picture." Another voice came from the crowd. This time it was a woman, one of the guests. "Is it true?" she asked, turning to the host. "Because if it is, I don't want to be a part of it. And I think a lot of people here would agree." The crowd began to buzz louder. People who had previously just watched were now beginning to side with Shaq. The whispers turned to outright outrage. The organizer of the event began to fidget, his face turning red. Shaq raised his hand, silencing the crowd. His voice was quiet, but everyone heard him. "This isn't about one party. It's not about one night. It's about how we let the system work. Every time we stay silent, every time we justify these actions, we become part of the problem. And if it doesn't change today, what will happen tomorrow?" The crowd froze again. The host of the event tried to say something, but his words stuck in his throat. Shaq's words were too powerful, and the truth was too obvious. "You can hide behind your rules," Shaq continued, his voice firm, "but rules are always made by people, and today I say this has to end, here and now." His words sounded like a sentence. The master, overwhelmed not only by the truth but also by the crowd's reaction, took a step back. People began to move closer to Shaq, applauding. Their anger was directed at the one who tried to hide behind a mask of innocence. Injustice had been exposed, and no one could ignore it any longer. The hall was no longer a place of fun. A glamorous evening that was supposed to be a celebration of exclusivity had turned into a scene of exposure and rage. The crowd huddled around Shaq and the confused organizer. Every guest felt they had witnessed more than just an incident. The system, hidden behind the luxurious facades, had begun to collapse. Shaq stood in the center of the chaos, his figure towering and his voice, though quiet, louder than any excuses. The attention of the crowd now turned to the staff, those who stood at the doors, those who were following orders, and those who were trying to justify themselves. Their faces expressed a mixture of fear, shame, and, in some cases, still stubborn resistance. "I want each of you to think," Shaq said, looking around at the staff. "How many times have you looked at someone and thought, that person doesn't deserve to be here? How many times have you followed the rules knowing they were unfair? And most importantly, how many times have you chosen to remain silent when you saw an injustice?" His words hit the mark. One of the employees standing at the door averted his eyes. It was a young man, clearly nervous. He tried to take a step back, but the crowd remained dense. Finally, he spoke, unable to stand. "We just do what we're told. We're told to keep an eye on the dress code and the—" He hesitated before adding, "the atmosphere of the event." Shaq looked at him, his gaze not judgmental but penetrating. "And who told you that? Who made you realize that atmosphere meant excluding certain people?" he asked, raising his voice slowly. The young man blushed and looked at the woman, the one standing at the entrance. She flinched, her lips curved in a grimace, but she remained stubborn. "No one said anything directly," she muttered, her voice barely audible but loud enough for everyone to hear. "But it was implied. We knew who we had to let through and who we didn't. We needed to enforce the standard." "And you've decided I don't meet the standard?" Shaq asked, his voice as hard as steel. She nodded, barely perceptibly, but it was enough. The crowd began to murmur. The guests began to discuss what they had heard, and their outrage grew louder and louder. One of the guests, an older man in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "Who are these people to decide who is fit and who is not?" he asked loudly. "This is not just a mistake. It's a deliberate humiliation. Who taught them that?" The crowd supported his words with applause. At that moment, the organizer of the event realized that his position was threatened. He raised his hand in an attempt to calm people down. "I recognize," he said loudly, trying to shout over the crowd, "that this is unacceptable. But understand that this is the result of individual decisions, not our policy." Shaq turned to him, his face cold. "Are you saying you had no idea what was going on at your events?" he asked, his tone harsh. "Or were you just turning a blind eye while everything was going smoothly?" The organizer turned pale. The crowd began to ask more and more questions. Several guests began to recall their own cases of injustice. One man recounted how an acquaintance of his had been turned away from last year's event because he looked weird. Another guest recalled how his neighbor, a woman of African descent, had once been denied entry despite an official invitation. Shaq remained silent, letting people talk. He realized that the truth was revealing itself, and that the words of the guests were what would finally destroy the facade of this event. "It's not just about my case," he said as the noise began to die down. "It's about how you let it go on. Every time you see injustice and you stay silent, you become part of it, and that's not going to change until we start talking about it openly." The crowd applauded. People began to raise their phones, recording what was happening. The host of the event, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to restore order. "We will investigate," he said, but his words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. The people no longer believed in empty promises. Shaq smiled, but his smile was bitter. He knew victory was close, but it was not yet complete. The crowd demanded justice, and this night would never be forgotten again. The crowd, which had been a spectator until a few minutes ago, now split into two camps. Some guests were whispering, casting wary glances at Shaq and the staff, while others supported him more and more confidently. The air in the hall was electrified, as if an invisible tension had reached a boiling point. But Shaq remained as steadfast as a rock in the midst of the waves. He raised his hand, gesturing to calm the seething crowd. His voice, low and confident, cut through the noise. "I can see how many of you are now thinking, it's none of my business. But let me ask you this, isn't it? How many times have you walked past injustice yourself, afraid to intervene? How many times have you seen someone facing prejudice and remained silent? Today, here, you have a chance to make a difference." The crowd began to quiet down, his words sounding like a call to action. People who had been watching began to wonder what they could do. Shaq could feel their attention focusing on him as his words began to penetrate their minds. This night was supposed to be about celebration. He continued, his voice softer, but everyone heard it clearly. But it became a lesson for me, for you, for all of us. A lesson that the world won't change until we start telling the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it is. A voice sounded from the depths of the crowd. The woman who had been silent earlier stepped forward. Her face was a mixture of determination and shame. "You're right," she said, her voice trembling. "We are all to blame. I've seen people humiliated at events like this myself, and I never said anything. But now I see how wrong it is." Her words set off a chain reaction. Another man, then a couple, and then several other guests began to speak. They recounted incidents they had witnessed, moments when they had chosen to remain silent. Now their voices were merging with Shaq's, creating a single chorus of truth. The organizer of the event stood silent, his face a mixture of confusion and shame. He tried to keep control of the situation, but realized that it was no longer possible. Shaq turned to him, his eyes full of determination. "Do you see what's happening? People are starting to realize that silence is part of the problem, and I won't let you hide behind words about dress code or rules again. Here and now, we see the truth, and it will not be forgotten." The crowd responded with applause. The people who had been standing on the sidelines now began to move closer, surrounding Shaq. His words inspired them, gave them the power to speak. It was no longer his fight. It became their common fight. The organizer raised his hand, his voice sounding strangled. I realize we made a mistake. We'll take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. I apologize to everyone." But Shaq only shook his head. "It's not enough. It's not apologies that change the world. It's action. Today, I see that people are ready to act, and I hope you will choose to do the same. Because if you don't, this evening will not be a celebration, but a lesson you have forgotten." With those words, Shaq turned around and headed for the exit. The crowd parted, but they did not let him go in silence. Applause and shouts of approval followed him. People realized that they had witnessed something more than a scandal. Shaq had shown them the power of the voice, the power of truth. That night will never be forgotten again. It will remain in the memory of everyone who was there as the moment when one person, unafraid to speak out, changed not only his own outcome, but also the consciousness of others. Shaq had barely taken a few steps towards the exit when the event organizer, visibly nervous, hurried to catch up with him. The crowd fell silent again, as if waiting to see how this confrontation would end. The organizer's face was pale, but he tried to look confident, though his hands showed tension, trembling with every movement. "Shaq, please, let's discuss this," he began, his voice both agitated and pleading. "I realize that there has been a misunderstanding, and I am willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Please, let us make amends." Shaq stopped, turned around, and looked at him in a way that made the organizer instinctively take a step back. There was determination in his eyes, mixed with disappointment. "Misunderstanding?" Shaq repeated, his voice quiet but steeled. "Is that what you call the systematic discrimination you've been perpetuating for years? You want to fix it? Then tell me what you're going to do about it." The organizer hesitated. His face reddened, and he began to search for words. Of course we'll conduct an internal investigation. We'll review our rules, make sure it doesn't happen again." Shaq raised his hand, stopping him. "An internal investigation?" he asked, his voice full of sarcasm. "You think anyone would believe that you would change your system from within, without outside pressure? It's just a way to silence the situation until people forget. But I won't, and neither will they." He pointed to the crowd, who were watching with interest and tension. Another man from the staff, one of the managers who had been silent earlier, approached the crowd. He stepped forward, folding his arms across his chest. His voice was more confident, but he sounded nervous. "We admit our mistakes," he said. "We are prepared to publicly apologize and compensate you for this misunderstanding. Perhaps free admission to our next events." The crowd gasped. A few people began to chatter, expressing their displeasure. Shaq grinned, but there was no mirth in his grin. "Free participation?" he interjected, his voice louder. "Do you think my dignity can be bought with an invitation? Or maybe you think it will make up for the humiliation I've suffered? It's not an apology. It's an attempt to save face." The crowd began to applaud. People cheered Shaq, his words resonating with anyone who had ever felt injustice. He took a step forward, approaching the organizer and manager. "Do you want to apologize?" "Then start with the truth," he said, looking directly at them. "Admit that the problem is not with individual employees, but with the system you've created. Admit that you hired people with an attitude of protecting the atmosphere that became code for discrimination. Recognize that this isn't the first time this has happened, and if nothing changes, it won't be the last." The organizer opened his mouth, but could not say anything. His face expressed a mixture of embarrassment and fear. The manager took a step back, obviously sensing that the situation went beyond the usual apology. Shaq addressed the crowd again, raising his hand. "They think they can offer us an apology and go on as if nothing happened. But it didn't. We will not accept half measures. We will not accept empty words. We demand change. And that's not a request, it's a demand." The crowd exploded with applause. People began shouting words of encouragement, their energy filling the room. Shaq stood in the center, his figure towering over the chaos he had caused. But it wasn't destructive chaos. It was the energy of change. The organizer, turning pale, realized that the situation was out of control. He raised his hand to calm the crowd, but his voice was drowned in the noise. People didn't want to hear excuses anymore. They wanted action. Shaq looked at the organizer one last time. "You know what needs to be done," he said, his voice calm but full of power. "And if you don't do it, we will, because the world must no longer tolerate such systems." With those words, Shaq turned and headed for the exit. The crowd began to follow him, their voices echoing through the hall. This was more than an evening. It was the beginning of a change that no one could stop. As Big Shaq headed for the exit, the crowd followed him. This was no longer just a glamorous event where people in designer clothes gathered for status. It became a place where questions were raised about what it means to be equal, and where everyone made a choice to stand aside or fight for the truth. The organizer stood at the center of the hall, confused and helpless. His attempts to calm the situation were in vain. Shaq, leaving, left behind not only uncomfortable questions but also a spark that lit the hearts of those who had been silent before. In front of the door, Shaq stopped. His broad back turned toward the crowd, but he felt every glance. He turned to look at the people who were waiting for his words. He didn't need to speak loudly. His voice now had a weight that everyone recognized. "Today is not about me," he began, his voice firm but not angry. "It's about each and every one of you. It's about the world we make. Discrimination, prejudice, injustice. These are not things that disappear on their own. They are removed by people who choose not to be silent when they see wrong. The crowd was silent. No one whispered. No one looked away. Everyone was gripped by his words. I leave here today knowing that the truth has been told, and I hope you leave here with that truth too. You can either continue to ignore it, or you can be part of the change. The decision is yours." Shaq paused, his gaze traveling around the room. He saw people's faces, confused, thoughtful, some inspired. He knew that not everyone would follow his words, but enough of them would change their lives. He took another step toward the door, but before he could walk out, he turned around and spoke. And to those who think it ends here, the world is watching. We will not be silent any longer." Those words hung in the air like a final warning. Shaq walked away, his steps firm, like a man who knows he's done the right thing. The crowd looked at him. Some began to applaud, gently at first, then louder, until the whole room erupted in applause. It wasn't just supportive applause. It was recognition that he had become a voice for those who had been silent for too long. The organizer tried to regain control. "Let's get on with the evening," he said, but his words were drowned in the noise of the crowd. People were no longer paying attention to him. Some of the guests, outraged by what had happened, left the event, saying they would no longer support this kind of party. A scandal that began as a personal incident became a loud statement about equality and justice. An evening that was meant to glorify luxury turned into a symbol of the struggle for dignity. Shaq left as a hero, but his departure was only the beginning. He didn't just prove that dignity doesn't depend on skin color, he lit a spark that will burn in the hearts of those who were there. People will never forget his words again, and the organizers of the evening, who stood in the shadow of shame, were now forced to think about how to change their system to make sure this never happens again. Friends, this story certainly touches on important and profound topics that are relevant to all of us. We would like to hear your opinion. How do you feel about what happened? Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? Share your experiences in the comments. Your words are really important to us and they can inspire others. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful to have you with us. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, please support us by liking and subscribing. It helps us continue to share meaningful stories that resonate with hearts. We wish you a wonderful day filled with nothing but kindness and justice.